Order. I call to order today's House of Commons Defence Committee evidence session. It is in fact our first hearing on our new inquiry, which is Defence in the High North. I am very pleased that we have an esteemed expert panel with us today. A very warm welcome back to Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe, who is a Professor of War Studies at Loughborough University. I'm very, very glad that you're back in front of the committee, Professor Kennedy-Pipe. We also are pleased to welcome Dr. Marc de Vore, who is a Senior Lecturer at the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews. Very, very welcome. And it's always great to have Mr. Ed Arnold, who's back with us. He's a Senior Research Fellow for European Security at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence Studies, RUSI for short. But without further ado, I'll now hand over to my colleague Lincoln Jopp to come in with the first question.
Professor, good morning and thank you for coming in. Is the High North becoming more strategically important, or has it always been strategically important and we're just waking up to it?
So I'm a creature of the Cold War. I believe the Arctic has always been important. If we look back, while the Soviet Union existed, it was where the Soviet Union plied its nuclear trade and threatened a variety of interests. It has become increasingly important because it is melting. Climate change is taking its toll, and new sea routes are opening up. They're not all open yet, but they are opening up. The Arctic is also home to rare earth minerals, oil and gas, which makes it not the Wild West, but perhaps the Wild North, as non-Arctic states begin to demonstrate considerable interest. So it's always been of importance, particularly, I would argue, in defence terms, but increasingly accessible. Russia has also, it is the predominant Arctic state. 53% of the Arctic coastline is Russian, and it has begun to remilitarize the Arctic and display aggressive tendencies in the High North. Bearing the chair's words in mind, just to sum up, it's climate, it's Russia, and of course we're all keenly aware of the eccentricities of President Trump in terms of his attitude towards Greenland and other parts of the Arctic. And I'll throw into that mix China, which a non-Arctic state, but a near-Arctic state according to its own propaganda, with an increasingly solid alliance with Russia, enabling both Russia and China to contest Western interests in the Arctic.
Do you think do you think we as a nation know where the British interest is in the High North?
I think we know, but I don't think we articulate it very well. But certainly looking at the British Isles and Ireland people, I believe that our strategic interests do lie in the High North. We have obligations around the world, of course, but if we look at our critical infrastructure, our fuel, our energy, our fish, then there is no doubt that we need to preserve and protect the approaches to the United Kingdom and our future scientific interests in the High North. The UK is profoundly affected by climate change, and we need to study that in order to understand how to mitigate its impacts.
Do either of the other panellists want to come in?
I just think on that final point from a UK perspective, I mean, I think Caroline covered it, but if you look, so SDR 2010, no mention of the Arctic, one paragraph in 2015. You've now got 3 Arctic policy frameworks, the defence in contribution to the High North document in 22. So actually the Arctic and the High North are the only sub-regions that the UK has specific policy documents for. And also I think it's quite interesting that no one has really driven that over the last 15 years from a UK position. It seems to be natural, and not just this committee, other committees as well. So it's not just on the policy side as well. So it's certainly a natural fit, and it's unusual, the focus on such an area when you don't have someone from the centre of government driving it. And it's also obviously continued through multiple changes in government.
I would support everything that my esteemed colleagues have said. I would just put a heavy emphasis on the fact that when we speak about the Russian threat, much of the Russian threat is localized in the Kola Peninsula, which means that its proximate threat to us is coming down through the Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea, into the North Atlantic. Today, at sea is the Russian spy ship Yantar and the BS-64 nuclear-powered mothership for essentially sabotaging our underwater critical infrastructure. The Russians have also invested very heavily in the cruise missile-carrying submarines, the Yasins. So, to some degree, when we think of Russia as the pacing threat that the United Kingdom faces, a big part of that puzzle that we have to face more directly than our allies and counterparts is the part that's coming from the High North.
A major chunk of the grey zone is actually white, is what we're saying. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. On to Fred Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Just wanted to pick up on something you said there, Ed, about government responsibilities. And it harks back to something I read from yourself in press recently around the High North and Scotland. And you're talking about how, although in the UK defence is led by government, resilience has devolved. And you're talking about Lossiemouth being a kind of UK MOD site, but the resilience of it, i.e. to kind of sabotage sort of sub-military threshold, being devolved to Scotland. Can you just tell us how concerned you are about this idea of resilience not being held by kind of nationally by the MOD, but sort of by cabinet and then devolved down?
Yeah, I think it's a machinery government issue that was highlighted during COVID as well, where you had slightly different guidelines and sort of different times of, changing tiers between Scotland, England and Wales. And sort of using that as an example, the issue is that defence is not a devolved competency, so done from Westminster MOD. Resilience is something that we always talk about, but it doesn't fit very neatly within machinery of government. But if you look at the two principal departments that would be looking at that from a Scottish point of view, that's the Scottish National Health Service and also Police Scotland, both in terms of protecting sites north of the border and if there were any casualties, either military or civilian, because that was the vector of attack, which Marc just alluded to. Those things really do need to be ironed out ahead of a crisis. And then I think in terms of the main threat to, for example, Lossiemouth specifically, I assess that as sabotage because it's the easiest way for the Russians to achieve their aims. They don't have to destroy every P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. They just need to damage them to a point that they're inoperable. And then you're taking out quite a large portion of NATO maritime patrol capability. And I think also if you look at what happened with Bryce Norton, Palestine Action, which was some paint in some engines, which then made those airframes inoperable, something similar on that level, so not a kinetic strike, could take out a large portion of that, and that would give freedom of manoeuvre for Russian submarines. So in terms of our threat and a location, I'd say Lossiemouth is certainly high up on the high-value priority list from a Russian perspective.
Yeah, I don't want to come on to other people's questions. I just wanted to pick up on that resilience devolved piece. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, now that we've set the scene, we're now going to be looking more in detail into the threats that we face, starting off with Derek Trigg.
Yeah, although part of it's been covered by your answers already, but I think just want to delve deeper into Russia and its capabilities, which we've touched on. Maybe we can go a bit deeper into that. And in terms of potential military scenarios that may occur or may not occur. Maybe Ed,
I think what Marc was talking about in terms of the particularly Russian submarine capability, it's in similar ways to the Cold War, they need access to the North Atlantic, so it's Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, also the Bear Gap further north. The main difference is that caliber cruise missiles are now almost a standard. There's a lot of refitting going on in terms of Russian maritime capability. So actually the Russians don't have to come as far out into the North Atlantic to threaten the east coast of the US. Therefore, NATO and also member states under Article 3 need to push that threat further north to sort of keep it at bay. And I see this also within the context of NATO transatlantic reinforcement. So in the strategic concept in 22, that was assessed as something that's absolutely critical to the alliance, so getting American forces over to Europe. From a Russian perspective, you're not going to wait for the Americans to meet up with all their kit and equipment in the Baltic states. You're going to target it when they're most vulnerable, which is crossing the North Atlantic, either by air or sea.
But it certainly makes the UK vulnerable, doesn't it? Because they're much closer to the UK.
Absolutely.
Because those people who think in this country, well, the Ukrainian front, the Eastern Front is way up there. Actually, coming down from the north, it's much closer to home, isn't it?
Absolutely, and the world doesn't look like how we were taught it is with a Mercator projection map with the UK in the middle. If you go on Google Earth and look at it from the top and basically spin the globe around, you start to get a much clearer picture of the threat vectors specifically to the UK.
What do you think the potential military scenarios are? Where could the clash be? Where could the spark be? In terms of the high north and the Arctic.
I think actually the spark, which I'm quite concerned about, is we have a lot of intelligence assessments to say when individual states and also NATO think that they may be at war with Russia. The issue is it may happen by miscalculation or accident. There's already been a couple of near misses in the last 4 years. I assess that if there is miscalculation, it is going to be in the Arctic and high north, just because of the amount of operational activity. Also, that operational activity is above the surface and below the surface. It's manoeuvring, and it also has a nuclear
Do you want
dimension.
to just remind the committee what the near misses were?
Say again, sorry?
To just remind us what the near misses were.
October the 8th, I think it was, 2022, when the RC-130 rivet joint was shot at over the Black Sea, as an example. So that was something that it was almost a double failure because the Russian pilot thought he'd been ordered to fire and also the missile missed. That type of activity happening in the Arctic or high north, I think there is a high probability. I don't think you get that same risk, say, for example, in the Baltics, because you have largely static forces that, through intelligence purposes, where they are and you'd understand if, for example, the Russians were going to make a move. So from miscalculation, I do think the threat to Northern Europe is severe.
Any other scenarios that might occur?
I think just quickly, hybrid activity. And I think this is one of the issues. Caroline mentioned it, that Arctic ice is melting, and when you take scientific assessments or whatever, it says between sort of 2040, 2050. And I think from a policy making position, we think, well, that's a future threat then, where we don't actually have to sort of consider it. But actually a lot of the issues that we've seen with critical underwater infrastructure of the Baltic, those ships have originated from the Indo-Pacific and have used the northern sea routes from a security vector, that we're already seeing this now. And then I think from a security point of view, you have to do something about it sooner rather than later.
Okay.
So one potential flashpoint is the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, where the Russians have a foothold, and there's been a noticeable uptick in activities. The Russians have a legitimate presence there under the Svalbard Treaty, but there has been hybrid activity, and the Russians have pushed very, very firmly on their interpretation of the Svalbard Treaty. Aligned to that, because of the accession of Sweden and Finland into the NATO alliance, the Russians have, in my view, been dispersing some of their assets away from Kola. And that means that we have a situation where the Russians are looking very keenly about where else to push interests. Svalbard is certainly one, and that would be below the threshold. But Bear Island has become increasingly important, as has the North Barents. I would also say that the Russians, because of the alliance with China, look at the joint military patrols and air patrols where they're taking place. We tend to lose sight that there is a Pacific Arctic as well as a European Arctic.
I would like to join Carolyn in emphasizing Svalbard and the Bear Island gaps importance, and perhaps we ought to think of that rather than the GI-UK gap as the forward line of where British interests lie in the high north. But on top of that, I'd like to add two other scenarios. The Russians care deeply about Eastern Europe, grabbing territory in Ukraine, potentially absorbing Belarus, doing things in Transnistria, Moldova, Baltic states. Under those scenarios, Russia's interest in the high north and North Atlantic is putting us in a position where we can't react and where we can't support our Eastern European allies. So from a Russian perspective, ideally, and the reason ships like Yantar and BS-64 are going into the North Atlantic is because they would like to lay surprises by our critical underwater infrastructure. The Russians would like to, before a crisis, inject cruise missile launching submarines into the North Atlantic so that when a crisis evolves in Eastern Europe, the Russians are then in a position where our policymakers don't know where there might be a submarine that could launch cruise missiles hitting Lossiemouth or Faslane. Our policymakers don't know when transatlantic underwater cables might be cut. So in some ways, what the Russians are trying to develop via the High North is leverage that they can parlay into territorial gains in Central Europe. Beyond that, we also should at some point discuss the Russian efforts to territorialize the Northern Sea Route and turn that into a de facto Suez Canal where they control access and where they can charge tolls for its use.
Thank you. On to Lincoln Joel.
I seem to remember about 10 years ago there was a flurry of interest in the world of anti-submarine warfare. People were saying it's just round the corner that we're going to be able to make the seas completely, I don't know what the word is, translucent, so that we would always know where all submarines are. I don't think it was Tom Clancy, but I think it was real science and a real hope for real science. Can any of you shed any light on any of making the seas viewable, as it were, subsea viewable? Has anything like that come up in the last 10 years?
I mean, that's the direction of travel, but I think the technology is not yet at that maturity, and you see it from the fact that we struggle to surveil underwater infrastructure at the moment, and there's a lot of effort going into that, and it's an area where there is pretty good public-private partnerships because a lot of the undersea infrastructure is actually privately owned. And it is also I'd say the hope of concepts such as Atlantic Bastion, which is when you don't have the surface vessels that you would like, you are pushed to the other option, which is effectively to try and use technology to surveil as much as possible. That said, there's always going to be blind spots. I think one of the issues with looking at the Arctic and High North is it is just vast areas that you need to surveil. And it's also not just about surveillance. I mean, yes, you want to track what is happening and where there's potentially nefarious activity, but you still need a direct action approach to then have an intervention on, either whether it is potential kinetic action or whether it is further sabotage. And being able to do that in such a vast geography is also very difficult.
But it's interesting with climate change because there's a difference between old ice and younger ice and where you can hide. And the Russians have historically, go back further than 10 years, taken to hiding in the Sargasso Sea, for example. So all of this is climate change and melting of ice and where surveillance is possible. And that will become more possible in certain parts of the Arctic, but not, for example, when you look at where the thick ice actually is.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's now concentrate on China and the High North. And to lead us off, we've got Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Marc, you've talked about Russian capabilities and how they're developing. Can you or any of the other members of the panel give us a sense of the parallel position in relation to China? Because what we see is rapidly increasing industrialization of defense capability in that country, and it would be interesting to know how that extends into naval and subsea and how it extends in relation to the High North or the quasi-High North, however they define themselves. So capabilities first, and then what the implications of that are.
Thank you. No, as you've That's a great question. As you mentioned, China's military capabilities and the relevant ones of the High North are growing quite rapidly. And probably that development has accelerated in the past couple years as more beholden to China for support in Ukraine. We have some indications that Russia is sharing nuclear submarine technology with China, which is one of the few areas where Russian defense production was still qualitatively superior to Chinese. So if I had to guess, I would guess that we would probably see a Chinese naval carrier group arriving in the High North circa 2040. Already, Chinese Coast Guard vessels have patrolled into the High North. So I would suspect that we will see a regular and persistent Chinese military presence in the High North. That said, I still think that when it comes to the High North and its militarization, Russia is the pacing threat. By all indications, China does not intend to have its ballistic missile submarines patrol in the High North. The South China Sea and the waters around Hainan Island are where they're building up that subsea surveillance network, the bases, and the standard operating procedures. China has an economic interest in access to the High North, and that is going to be backed up by military displays of force, but they don't have the same operational military objectives in the High North that the Russians do.
Thank you. Caroline or Ed?
So I think that Marc's entirely correct. If you look at the 20-year ambition for the Russian shipbuilding program, it's very ambitious in terms of envisaging 1,900 additional vessels, some of them civilian. But the Chinese have also got a massive shipbuilding program, particularly in terms of polar capabilities and the building of ships capable of operating both in the Arctic and in Antarctica. And then, of course, we come to China dual-purpose vessels, which again are increasing in number at both poles. So the Russians are ahead at the moment in building, but the Chinese are rapidly catching up. And again, I would point to the importance of the Chinese relationships to the Russians circumventing the sanctions regime in terms of shortages of parts. So I would see it not as merely a pragmatic alliance, but now as a deeply entrenched alliance.
Very interesting, thanks. Ed, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, what I mentioned earlier in terms of the Northern Sea route and where we have seen cable damage within the Baltic Sea, particularly the new polar bear and the Yipeng 3, I think there is almost certainly some form of collusion with Russia there, and I think it's really about China leveraging sort of the political optics of it. So, for example, with the Yipeng 3, it was sort of effectively pushed off to the coast of Denmark. And at the time, I mean, I think we as sort of the UK and also NATO should have probably given Denmark a little bit more support. But from the Danes, it's effectively, do we flag a Hong Kong, do we board a Hong Kong flagged vessel? The decision was not, and the Yipeng 3 left the Baltic, whereas at the moment there is more appetite to do it for either Russian flagged or aligned Shadow Fleet vessels. So I think China is able to use that for diplomatic cover to say that we can actually possibly do things within the Baltic Sea and other areas within the High North without too much risk of being boarded by European powers.
Very interesting. So just to draw out some really interesting points that you've made there. The first is, as you've all made, the first is that the dual use trope is likely to be one that we'll continue to see for reasons of hybrid warfare or grey zone type warfare. The second is that the industrial and defence cooperation is likely much closer in China in particular, given the structure of the economy and in Russia, than it would be necessarily here, and therefore there's more potential read across. As I understand what you've said, if I was taking a 20-year view backwards and forwards, I would say that China is quietly converting Russia into a client state, and nuclear energy is one of the very few areas in defence where Russia retains a sovereign capability that China is genuinely interested in the longer term. And therefore, from a Chinese standpoint, if it can provoke Russian semi-aggressive exercises and challenges to the West in the Atlantic and the High North, and preserve the opportunity to use the High North as a Suez transit point to the benefit of Chinese commerce, that's a pretty optimal outcome. Is that roughly your view?
Yeah, I think, again, we've mentioned Tom Clancy, but yes, I mean, it's certainly something that I think we misjudged 5 years ago, 3 years ago, when we didn't see very clearly the Chinese construction of an alternative rules-based order or disrules-based order to the West. And I think that China is keenly aware of the frailties of Russia and the Russian Federation, particularly in Siberia.
Keenly aware of the
deficiencies.
Yeah, fragility.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, I agree.
Of, for example, infrastructure on the Arctic coast, in Siberia, keenly aware of the demographics of Russia and the failure, really, of Russia to invest in the kind of equipment. Russia is rich in rare earth minerals, but it's only with the Chinese they've begun to be able to mine lithium, for example.
Okay, very, very interesting. So then that question, in turn, leads to the question, if we're failing to respond to Russian and Chinese potential, Russian action and Chinese potential assertiveness in the High North, what are the consequences of that, and what are the long-term implications for us?
So, sorry, Mark, you go.
I would say that the consequences are quite dire if we don't respond at pace.
It feels like we're not, right? I mean, it feels like we're getting quite a lot of challenge from Russia at the moment.
Yep. In
different forms. We're talking about putting a carrier strike group out in the north, which is the first meaningful attempt at kind of forward deterrence I've seen for a while. Is there other stuff going on that we should be aware of as a committee that, we're massively missing the wider picture, which is that the UK and the US are aggressively contesting the High North in the face of these challenges, and it's not being caught by commentators and media?
So I would say that we have begun to respond, but our response is fragmented and it is a bit behind the curve when we compare that to the pace of what our adversaries are doing in the High North. Now, to go back to the original question of what are the costs of inaction, I'd like to break down the Russia backed up by China in 3 distinct domains and try to drill down into the costs. So if we fail to, alongside our allies, have a naval posture that's capable of detecting and following Russian vessels, and particularly submarines, as they come down from Kola into the North Atlantic, then we are going to be deeply weakened the next time we have to face Russia in a crisis, whether that's in Central Europe or elsewhere. That could also be a challenge for us responding to a crisis involving China if Russia has, as you've suggested, is conducting parallel operations in Europe to prevent Europe and perhaps distract the United States from responding to something that China might be doing. If we don't act to contest Russia's illegal efforts to territorialize the Northern Sea Route, these are their laws of 2012, 2020, 2018, and 2022, we will find ourselves after 2030, when the Northern Sea Route becomes navigable all year long, with the Russians having set up a de facto monopoly on transit, where they are both making money off of that, but also where they can use that as a form of leverage. They don't like how the level of support that Denmark's providing to Ukraine, they can cut off Maersk ships from sailing the Northern Sea Route. So failing to contest that through freedom of navigation operations is going to give Russia a tremendous amount of both wealth and geopolitical leverage. And finally, getting to Carolyn's earlier point, if we don't pay attention to Svalbard and Bear Island archipelagos, we're going to have a situation where our allies are going to be investing their defense efforts on securing bits of their territory that they view as at risk, as opposed to investing in a common JEF or NATO posture in the High North. I found it remarkable when I was in Svalbard last year that there were Norwegian warships sitting off the Svalbard coast every single day. And that's significant when you consider that Norway has 4 extremely high-grade warships, so that is an extremely high percentage of their deployable capacity that's sitting there to deter Russia, as opposed to participating in other broader NATO endeavors. So a fragmented alliance, a wealthier Russia, and an empowered Russia, and our own decision-making constrained are the effects of inaction.
Okay, that's very helpful. Ed?
Yeah, just 2 points. I think when you're talking about sort of the opportunity here, I mean, NATO has really been handed the opportunity on a plate through the failure of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly with Finland and Sweden joining. I mean, that has completely transformed the alliance. I think NATO was very slow to catch on to Russian remilitarization in the Arctic. And essentially what's happened is the Russians invested Arctic capabilities into Ukraine, the 200th and the 64th Motor Rifle, plus a lot of air defense that is usually in the north. And I always use it as an example when we say that NATO is a defensive alliance. I mean, Putin knows that because he effectively left the Kola Peninsula, which is the source of strategic and political power for the Russians militarily, effectively undefended, particularly when there's one highway, the 105, that goes from St. Petersburg to Murmansk, and that's now in fire control range of Finland. So it's a huge opportunity for NATO to continue the overmatch that we now have, and I think that opportunity absolutely must be taken.
And they've lost the Baltic.
Yep.
Yes, and I think just secondly, just to highlight a point that colleagues Sid Korshall and Ed Black made in a recent paper on Atlantic Bastion, is just from the Russian naval position in terms of the Northern Fleet. They don't have to destroy or defeat NATO maritime activity in the Arctic, the High North, the Atlantic. They need to disrupt and buy time for the land operation in Europe to succeed. So it's a different way that they are looking at potential operations in the north as well.
That's very helpful, interesting. Thank you. Caroline, did you want to come in?
Just to add to what colleagues have said, in the sense of the high north for Russia, 20% of Russia is in the Arctic. It is a place that cannot be relinquished. It holds future keys, Putin believes, to prosperity, and it will be defended and it will be contested. And so the Northern Sea route, Marc is quite right, is the lifeblood for Russia and poses a series of opportunities and constraints. And the Russians have been pushing, of course, for legal recognition much further into the Arctic. So there'll be the Russian question is, how does it behave? Militarily, hybrid, grey, propaganda, and using the tools at its disposal. And that will be, remember, it's not simply Russia-China now, it's BRICS. And the Russians have a series of alliances of other powers interested in the Arctic. They will not give up Bear Island, the Barents, and we have pressed them very, very hard in the Baltic. And so that's why I think we'll see a dispersal of Russian forces and interests into other parts of the Arctic. The remilitarization of the islands is extremely telling. But Ed's right, there are opportunities here. The Russians have internally caused a lot of domestic concern with their attitude towards the indigenous people who have suffered disproportionately in terms of conscription into Ukraine. And that creates opportunities for leverage. And again, the Chinese have stepped in. So Russia is not harmonious. Russia is subject to a series of conflicting trends, but that doesn't lessen its ambitions. And the key question is a contained Russia will see its opportunities coming in the next few years before there is serious rearmament in the West.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very sobering assessment of the threats from the three of you, but also very interesting review of the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's now move on from China onto NATO and the US with Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess we spoke a bit about NATO just there. One thing I wanted to pick up on, if I come to yourself, Professor Caroline, as Ed laid out, there's quite clear potential for NATO policies on land with that route up to Murmansk and now Finland clearly being part of NATO. I wanted to ask what your view is around NATO. How clear is NATO's operating model and policy for maritime operations joint across NATO countries, and in the context of, in terms of submarines, clearly the UK and France being European NATO's leading countries. But to what extent are those countries operating together under NATO versus sort of unilaterally, or maybe with us it's in the UK, it's more bilaterally with the US. But can you give us an idea of how joined up that is?
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at NATO, then we're all aware of the shocks to the system that President Trump has inflicted. But in terms of opportunities, if we can come back to what the Right Honourable Member said, in terms of, I think, growing alignment in terms of Norway, Denmark, increasingly Iceland, I think we have to think, we'll come on to Jeff, I'm sure, but we've got to think, I think, of a UK-led European type of response in the Arctic, because we simply cannot know what the Americans are going to commit to. So I would urge very strongly, obviously we have the First Sea Lord's vision of a serious convergence which has already taken place with Norway, increasingly with Denmark and Iceland for that European component. Canadians also, in addition, and there's a concern over the Canadians because of the Northwest Passage and the fact that President Trump's disagreements with the Canadians on that transit through the Canadian archipelago also offers avenues for China. So at the moment, I think it's precarious, and that there needs to be a concerted European effort in terms of maritime defence.
Okay, thank you. Marc, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would agree vociferously with everything that Carolyn said, but I would add that even beyond the High North, no alliance of 32 countries has ever flexibly and agilely responded to crises. And that's sort of NATO's problem. NATO is large, depends on consensus, includes, besides the United States, who it sometimes now has Arctic ambitions that are deeply threatening to Denmark and Canada. But besides that, we have Slovakia, Hungary, countries that sometimes are confused about what team they're on when it comes to containing Russia. Greece and Turkey, who oftentimes like tilting at one another as opposed to engaging in transatlantic policymaking. So while NATO's Article 5 and NATO First may be very good foundations for overall UK existential security, NATO is not fit for purpose when it comes to creating policy for a very swiftly changing environment such as the High North. And for the High North, I would say that the best format, or the format I would favor, would be a sort of JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force plus format. The 10 Nordic, Baltic, and North Sea countries of the Joint Expeditionary Force that includes all of NATO's Arctic countries, save the United States and Canada, and the JEF also is quite flexible when it comes to staging exercises and developing policy responses.
Yeah, we're going to come on to JEF in a bit, so sorry to cut you off, but I totally recognise what you're saying. And I also, while I've got the mic, wanted to ask you something else, Dr. Marc. I know you've done a lot of work on military innovation, and to ask from a NATO point of view, obviously NATO's got NATO Diana, the NATO Investment Fund, as a whole innovation team, sometimes struggle to get technology to be adopted by NATO. I've got a question about Ukraine, and NATO in the High North. So to what extent are the technologies that we're seeing rapidly evolve through innovation at war in Ukraine, be they on land, sea or air, to what extent will they be applicable to sort of a potential, any potential fighting in the north? And to what extent should NATO lean into that? Or not?
That is a great question. So first, the technologies are absolutely applicable, but not in the exact state of the way that they were used in the Black Sea or in the Russia-Ukraine war. So if we were to think, what should a UK, Norwegian, JEF, NATO posture look vis-a-vis Russia in the Bear Island Gap 10 years from now, it should definitely involve USVs, unmanned surface vessels, unmanned underwater vessels, persistent drones providing ISR, underwater, cheap acoustic sensors, all things that have been proven in Ukraine. Now, as I'm sure Carolyn is going to come in and describe it in greater detail, the operating environment in the High North is environmentally much more challenging. So these systems need to be gotten up there, tested, and proofed in this particular environment in order to translate those lessons to the High North. And probably one would say the same would be the case if one is trying to think of how does one apply the same one-way attack drone being combined with more exquisite systems in the way that the Ukrainians have established strike wrappers and packages that are capable of penetrating most Russian air defenses. One would need to tweak that and develop specific weather-proofed versions of the technology and exercise them alongside our allies before one can adequately translate the lessons of Russia-Ukraine to a more efficient military posture in the High North.
Thank you.
And it also depends which part of the Russian Arctic you're talking about. Because if you look at the drone attacks north of Irkutsk recently, very successful, but then you've got to think in a more agile way about how you deliver uncrewed systems. And Marc's quite right that you can look at some of the coldest places in the world in Siberia and see what will work and won't work. But then you've also got a problem in the Arctic in terms of looking at the use of certain types of uncrewed systems with acoustics and how they will actually operate. So the agility, the innovation is interesting, but it needs, if you're going down to minus 30, minus 35. But I think it depends where you're targeting in the Russian Arctic. And it doesn't have to be Central Arctic Ocean, and it doesn't have to be in those places that are still remotely frozen. Russia has, I come back to that word again, a great deal of fragility in its infrastructure, and we've seen that it can be hurt.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you. Just last one with me. Ed, can I ask you, your colleagues on the panel have been clear the need for collaboration and leadership outside of NATO constructs in the High North. What's your view? Does NATO have clear policies for security and defence in the High North?
Yeah, I think it has clear policies, and like say at a macro level it is assuring transatlantic reinforcement. Certainly a couple of years ago you could sort of summarise any national defence plan under Article 3 from the Nordic and Baltic states who effectively fight until the Americans come. And I think there's no real change there. There's just more question marks of politically whether the Americans will come in terms of that transatlantic reinforcement. And for that transatlantic reinforcement, in terms of the NATO regional plans, the Northwest plan is the most important. And the recent changes in NATO's command structure, principally the UK gaining command of Norfolk and Virginia, which is for the North, and the US moving to command Marcom to have all of the theatre component commands under them, again gives an element of an opportunity, because the way that NATO is looking at defence now is sort of your base layer is your national defence plans under Article 3. You then have a variety of minilaterals, bilaterals, so principally GEF, NORDEFCO in the north, which is coherence, and then sitting atop of that you have the regional plans. It's absolutely critical for Europeans that you can run that regional plan northwest with little to no US support, and now it is effectively given us the opportunity if we resource it. And I think the former military members of the committee will understand that we always say, like, well, headquarters, command, etc. There's actually a lot that goes underneath that, which will have to be resourced from us, for example, staff officers surging into Norfolk and making sure that whichever plan it is that we are using, you get seamless change in command, which you now can do because Finland and Sweden are in NATO, and that means in NATO, and that means all GEF members are NATO.
Thank you.
But these are dangerous times in the sense of looking at the transfer of US personnel out. It is an opportunity, but it also might signal something, more portentous for the future, and I think that has to be taken into account.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's now move on to the US with Emily.
Morning all. I think this will largely be for yourself, Professor Kennedy Pipe, and it might be difficult to predict, but what do you think the likely direction of the United States' policy in the region is, given the recent desires of the President on Greenland and Canada, and yet their long-term foreign policy pivot in the National Defence Strategy towards the Indo-Pacific?
So it's interesting. The committee doesn't need me to tell them how bizarre it seems that President Trump would like to purchase Greenland, particularly because the indigenous people of Greenland don't believe in ownership. So they found it really rather odd that they are caught in this position. And the intriguing issue is, of course, President Trump's view that Greenland is indispensable to the protection of the east coast of the United States, even though under the 1951 treaty, the United States have the wherewithal to do as they wish on Greenland, and that is quite clear. The second is the disregard for the Kingdom of Denmark and a keen NATO ally, and I'm sure we were all dismayed by the derogatory comments made about the Danes in places like Afghanistan. So I think this is troublesome. But if we look at US Arctic strategy, it was not interested in the Arctic for many, many years, neglected its capabilities there. And then under President Trump, we have begun to see a keener awareness of Alaska, Chinese incursions offshore Alaska, and what that might mean for the American position, as well as I mentioned earlier, the ongoing dispute with Canada over the Northwest Passage, which is serious as it opens up. So looking ahead, I think that what was on the table between President Trump and Putin was what I call a sphere of influence. Putin stayed out of Greenland for a very long time, saying it wasn't Russian business, but the quid pro quo would be an enhanced interest in Svalbard, sitting across from eastern Greenland. So until very recently, let's say last night, and Iran, I think the Russians and the Americans had conceived of an Arctic that was quite clearly divided. Now that's been thrown into disarray, if I can extend into the Russian relationship with Iran. But nevertheless, the Americans are quite clear. Now this is where opportunities and constraints for NATO. Denmark is an ally of the United Kingdom, promises much in terms of defence interchangeability through our alliance structure. So in 20 years' time, I think that the United States, crystal ball gazing, will find itself seriously disadvantaged in the Arctic between China. Russia, I agree, is not the threat, but China certainly has ambitions both in the Pacific and the European Arctic. So the Americans need to be careful in the sense that this tilt to Indo-Pacific we understand in terms of trade and its own threat assessment, but the East Coast is extremely vulnerable to Chinese, Russian attacks in 20 years' time. So as the Arctic melts, And 20 years is a long time in the Arctic. Northern Sea Route, Northwest Passage, more trade, more actors, South Korea, Japan. So the Arctic 8 will begin to lose their grip on Arctic politics. The circumpolar Arctic as we know it will become unrecognizable with climate change. So I think this is an opportunity for the Europeans to really carve out is a terrible phrase, but begin to influence the direction of traffic with our Arctic allies. But we cannot count on the United States, that's entirely clear. And I think the PM, again, not to step outside the remit, the prudence, the abiding by international law sets a very interesting precedent for the Arctic. Because once international law is ignored on trade routes, and remember that the Arctic exists under Article 234, which protects the rights of transit and the rights of Arctic ice, then we're beginning in 20 years' time to move into a very permissive environment. And also, I would add, those riches on the seabed and in places like Greenland are indispensable to modern economies.
Dr. Vore, you seem to be nodding away. Is there something you want to add? You looked very keen.
I'm not sure I would have raised my hand, but now that you've called on me.
Sorry.
No, I would.
No pressure.
I would say that even beyond Trump and his particular idiosyncratic aspects, we can't count on the United States returning to the European Arctic as the security partner and ally that we previously counted on. Now, part of the reason is what you described, the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific area. I spent much of December in Taiwan, and there the Americans view the window for maximum likelihood of a war kicking off in East Asia as 2027 to 2035. Perhaps pushing that back as far as 2049, where they think that Xi Jinping has set an objective that Taiwan must be reunified forcibly with China by that date. So even if the next U.S. president was a dyed-in-the-wool Atlanticist, Eisenhower 2.0 or something, that doesn't mean that the U.S. would not have the capacity to pivot back to playing the role it did in Europe and Europe's high north. And I'm not sure that even other potential, at Davos, a fair number of Republicans and Democrats showed up this past year, and very few articulated the traditional American policy of engagement with Europe and in the high north. One had varieties of isolationism, one had various varieties of parlaying American grand power, military power into economic benefit, but there was nothing that signaled that we can hope that the next U.S. president or the president after that will have the bandwidth and interest to coming back and playing the role that the U.S. played here in the 1980s, 1990s.
And thank you both for that. Just to come back on something you said at the start of your response to me, Professor, you said see, they've got the powers, Americans, to do what they want anyway in Greenland. So do you think they'd use those powers? Have they used them? What do you see as their next kind of step there?
If President Trump is serious that Greenland is indispensable to the defence perimeter, then they already have Beatavik Air Base. They used to have 51 bases around Greenland, some of which were left in considerable disarray. There is nothing to stop. But if one believes that actually, as we've seen in Ukraine and other parts of the world, that it's the rare earth minerals that might be of more interest to President Trump, then that would be a different type of engagement entirely on Greenland. But yes, it's a bit of a red herring, this idea of Greenland is indispensable, because the Americans and the Danes have been quite clear that they would not prohibit American militarization on Greenland. So the puzzle is, what does President Trump really want? And it is, I think, those rare earth minerals control. But remember, if you look at America and the globe, and I should have, forgive me, brought a map. From 1946 on, when President Truman tried to buy the place, the island, it was always named as indispensable to the American hemisphere and its control. So we've got a mix of things going on in terms of Greenland, and come back to the indigenous people. They must surely have a right and say in their own future, and also in the richness of the earth that lies beneath. So yes, I think it's rare earth minerals that is driving his interest in that particular part of the world, rather than defence. And just quickly coming back, if there is a threat to the east coast of the United States, it doesn't have to come across Greenland. It can go round the other pole, and that brings into play the Falklands, which I think is also of interest.
Thank you for those detailed answers. I'll let you move on, Chair.
Thank you very much. Let's now come on to UK policy with Calvin Bailey.
Thanks very much. I've been trying to keep pace with the different groupings as you've all been speaking. I've got Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. The SDR makes a reference to multilateral groupings and the importance in the defence of the High North. Clearly, GEF is a significant one of those groupings that faces to the north, but have also spoken about the significance of both Finland and Sweden entering NATO. My question is, should the UK have a leadership role in the High North, and under which grouping should that be?
I think we already have a leadership role in the High North, and I think the First Sea Lord articulated a vision of deterrence for the UK, which would include friends and partners. For many of us, the GEF is an obvious vehicle that has been proven, and unlike many other European structures, has actually been deployed, which is good. It is flexible. It does not require unanimous voting, as NATO does, and I think it proves that agility, particularly under the threshold. So I would see GEF, but also with some framework nations adding, as something that the UK can lead on. Now we'll come back, I'm sure, to the issue of funding, but it has proven itself, I think, to be a very distinct pillar of how to deal with these threats in the High North.
Caroline, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the UK has a choice now, particularly with gaining command of Norfolk. You know, so if you're looking at it through a NATO first prism, I mean, that's absolutely essential. And then if you bring it back down to sort of the UK's Article 3 outlook, you know, we've all mentioned that the threat comes from the north. So I think it's absolutely clear. I've said previously in an answer, it feels natural, and the UK feels the natural partner of choice to particularly Nordic countries who, for a variety of reasons, have chosen previously to keep sort of Arctic issues, particularly around hard security, to themselves. And looking at Article 3, they're now actually wanting more enhanced partnerships due to the fluctuating US position. The GEF absolutely has benefits, but I feel that we're not making best use of them. I've written a lot on the GEF and effectively said, well, these are strengths, but if you don't use them, you will lose them. So if you look at Baltic Sentry, that was established after critical national infrastructure attacks in the Baltic Sea, well, actually the GEF didn't react, despite the fact it's in its core area of interest and that the GEF at the time was prioritising critical underwater infrastructure. Variety of reasons behind that, but principally the fact that Poland and Germany, particularly with Germany now hosting NATO's Maritime Component Command in the Baltic, are not members of GEF. So this idea previously that a lot of people said, well, the GEF can act while NATO does the thinking, that was not the case in that area. So then you're suddenly like, well, hang on, what is the GEF for? The GEF has also done activity which has supported Baltic Sentry. Well, why is the JEF supporting NATO activity when the JEF is already fully composed of NATO? Where I think the JEF could make a real difference is actually not a complete change, but a refocus to actually where JEF activity focuses more on the Arctic and High North, particularly where our command and control and military capabilities would be best served. And you provide the protection to the Baltic states, who are members as well, by effectively screening the Danish Straits. So you're actually preventing the sources of potential nefarious activity even getting into the Baltic, because there's obviously an element of diplomacy here. But at the moment, in theory, Article 3, the unilateral level, and then the NATO layer all align in terms of command, and the UK sitting on top of that pyramid.
Okay, is there, before I come to you, Marc, just to qualify this, so JEF valid, somewhere we should be proposing or showing leadership then. Marc, to come to you, is there then a pacing threat in that we, to demonstrate leadership, we have to meet or exceed the pace of the expenditure and contributions of the other members of that grouping?
There is a certain, I vehemently agree with you. Our allies in the JEF and are looking to us for leadership. If you go to Oslo or Copenhagen, they are asking for more. They're asking for more of a cohering function. They're asking for more of a strategic vision. But in order to provide that leadership, we have to be fully coherent in what we're doing as well. Part of that means making the JEF, take a Pinocchio illusion. We have to make it a real boy. Right now, the JEF mostly consists of annual head of government, head of state meetings with a lot of informal work that goes on the side. If we're serious about making the JEF a policy tool that is fit for purpose for cohering action in this area, it should have a real headquarters. It should have a small secretariat, not necessarily something as bloated as what NATO has, but a small professional secretariat and a small permanent military planning headquarters. We should also put it somewhere central within the JEF region. It should not be sitting over here on UK soil, but we should put it in Copenhagen or Oslo or someplace that looks more geographically center. The UK is the only JEF member that can provide the policy expertise and has the bandwidth to help cohere that. And then also, Carolyn has on several occasions mentioned the First Sea Lord's vision, and we have taken a number of measures that show that we're moving in the right direction, that we have reprioritized the North Atlantic and the High North, Atlantic Bastion in the SDR, Atlantic Strike, Atlantic Shield, both mentioned in the First Sea Lord speech at the Sea Power Conference, Operation Firecrest, sending the carrier battle group up to the High North, the Royal Marines regularly deploying to northern Norway, and Camp Viking. So we've outlined a lot of activity that goes in the right direction. But there is a real say-do gap. Probably at current level of resourcing, doing those properly executing those initiatives at the same time as following through on the Royal Navy's procurement of frigates, which the Royal Navy has become quite run down, is going to cost something like $4 billion extra over the next 3 years, above and beyond what is likely in the defense equipment program, which none of us have seen. So I think that there is a say-do gap, and also there is something of a gap in terms of living up to our rhetoric when it comes to doing in terms of our policy decisions. I was at the French Atlantic Fleet's headquarters a couple of weeks ago. Whenever I want to learn things about the British Navy, I tend to speak to the French. And there I got chided at the fact that we have one Astute-class submarine at sea, and it's heading for Australia. So the French admiral said, oh, you talk such a good game when it comes to the high north, and we agree with your prioritization there, but you only have one submarine at sea, and it's heading towards the other part of the world to deter a adversary that your country is not willing to call out as a foreign policy threat. So our allies are looking for leadership. On paper, a lot of what we are doing is in the right direction, but there is a real challenge when it comes to coherence and putting our money where our mouth is.
Thanks very much. I was going to draw you in. I could see you.
You go and
No. I could see your face.
I just think a couple of data points to sort of support Mark. I mean, when you look at percentage spend of GDP on defence through the GEF members, the UK was the only one to meet 2% in 2014. We're now ninth. And Iceland are 10 without a military. It could be worse. And I think, all my analysis on the GEF was that it worked because there is a framework nation that everyone can get around, and that at that point, anecdotally as well, a GEF member, former ambassador, said to me 2 years ago, he's like, well, in 2014, the UK sold the GEF to us. In 2024, we're selling the GEF to you. So I think, again, it's more that the UK can do. And also, I mean, there's a variety of things written by the Nordic Baltic 8. There was an opinion piece written fairly recently on it by some friends of mine, didn't mention the UK once. So the other, again, is if the GEF is not going to step up and the UK is not going to make that point that Mark just made, there are other options. Again, this sort of use it or lose it. But I think it's also worth understanding, like, we get obsessed with sort of command and control arrangements. We get obsessed with which group's doing what, the badges on our arm. Russia doesn't. Russia doesn't care if it's GEF or NATO, probably doesn't even realise, and he thinks generally all of the activity in the area is US anyway. So when we get transfixed by this, if you look at our enemy, they don't matter. They just see it as activity. They don't make that distinction.
Yeah, Russia never mentions the GEF.
Very, very rarely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Which is very sobering and is a clear indication that we do need to step up our spending, and a very apposite comparison of where we sit within that block, Ed. Marc, the Atlantic Bastion, you started to lead into it and talk about it as a clear and achievable policy for the UK. But can you elaborate on that or expand on it, particularly some of its constituent programmes such as SHIELD and Strike and the NET, perhaps?
So the Atlantic Bastion, SHIELD, and Strike are a nexus of programs. Now, thus far, in terms of what's been published, Atlantic, SHIELD, and Strike are about bumper sticker deep, in that they represent a good conceptual concept without as much detail in terms of what follow-through is. Now, big picture Atlantic Bastion is using a variety of sensors, unmanned vessels, underwater sensors to monitor traffic through the North Atlantic. And that means being able to identify Russian submarines as they try to transit towards the North Atlantic to areas where they could be a threat to us or our sea lines of communication. So in that sense, it does represent, and it builds on the back of Project Cabot and previous Royal Navy research, it does represent a judicious application of emerging technology to our security challenges. Now, one of the problems in this, I believe it was Carolyn that mentioned, the Russians are increasingly heading through and recognize that they might be identified coming through the North Atlantic, and then their plan is essentially for their submarines to lose NATO vessels trailing them in the Sargasso Sea, and then double back to whatever their intended target set is. So where we may have a problem with Atlantic Bastion is having enough frigates or attack submarines of our own that are then capable of following the Russian submarines as they've been identified, so that that track is not lost. Because our general assumption is that the Russians will try to surge their submarines into the Atlantic before a war breaks out. So if they're surging through the Atlantic Bastion while it is still peacetime, we can't sink them. So therefore, we have to essentially remain in contact with them until the balloon goes up. And it's that issue of having enough vessels that are capable of pursuing where the following through on our frigate purchases is it's not an either or with Atlantic Bastion, but it's the Atlantic Bastion becomes useless if you can't pursue afterwards. And that's also where allies become important, because they have the escorts that can help pursue once the bastion locates.
And that's quite clear in RUSI's report when RUSI discusses it. In a way, I wouldn't say it's damning. It just exposes that there are other challenges to it. One part that really sticks in my mind is the whole COCONO, the contractor-operated, contractor-owned, contractor-operated naval oversight. Is that a useful vehicle for incentivising industry in this regard?
Tentatively, I would say yes. What we have seen with Ukraine and elsewhere is that the pace of technological change is such that standard military organizations have trouble absorbing it at pace. So coming up with a vehicle that involves contractors more directly on the front line and more directly in providing it is a good adaptation that reflects what we're seeing states that we might want to benchmark ourselves doing. Now, as with so many clever procurement waves in the United Kingdom, oftentimes the devil is in the details and in the implementation.
So that's, would it then surprise you that for some bizarre reason we're expecting those contractors to work on a 1+1+4 contracting method where they would have to front load everything in year one? Is that kind of making a bit of a nonsense of incentivising companies to come in, placing all their risk on a 1-year contract?
Yes, I have misgivings about that, and I guess one of my major misgivings is that if our objective is to lure in new tech companies and build a better defense industrial ecosystem, by the time you force those front loading of investments, you've essentially ruled out a lot of the small and medium-sized enterprises, because who can absorb those sunk costs is essentially your BAEs and Babcocks, and it's not your small and medium-sized emerging tech firms that might.
Before I let go, is there, Ed, you're nodding, both of you are nodding. Any other contributions before I move forward?
No, I mean, I just think on the sort of the future technology side, I mean, the issue is UK and NATO, just because we have so few surface competence. And I think for me, it's, I'm an ex-infanteer, so I'm not going to sort of reel off sort of naval numbers to you, but it's all about availability of airframes and also vessels, which is the real issue, and that is what drives a lot of bilateral and trilateral cooperation, such as maritime patrol in North Atlantic. It's between the UK, the US and Norway. When the Germans come online under Trinity House, they can operate through Lossiemouth. So when you have that rotation of training, maintenance and operational, it gives you more availability. So actually what is really important is not the the problem is when you're looking at new technology and you're also wanting to support sort of homegrown startups, you start to do things at a national level, not a multinational level. I think looking at Atlantic Bastion, all of those concepts and how allies can support that, now is the time to go, okay, and what do we need, and design it with sort of allies in mind, and not do something, because then it's always the difficulty of integrating two different sort of systems in the future. We can avoid that, and there's obviously a lot of examples where that hasn't gone very well in European security.
Thank you.
Brilliant. On to Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Vore, I want to ask you about the growth agenda that could come from our work in the High North. So we've got a government that's talking a lot about defence growth and, dangling the opportunities to industry of, export deals. What are the opportunities that you think can come from a growth perspective from our High North work?
Thanks a lot. I actually think that there's quite significant defense export growth opportunity in the High North, provided that we do what my esteemed colleagues and I have said, which is really seize the bull by the horns and take leadership of security in the High North. The Nordics, the Canadians, our other High North allies, are countries that feel the Russian threat and China's increasing inroads into the area, as well as Donald Trump's idiosyncratic acquisitiveness, quite keenly. So their defense budgets are all rising quite rapidly, and as Ed mentioned, much faster than our own. So these are all countries that are re-equipping quite quickly. There's not many countries that build warships that are even moderately capable of operating in the High North. For the UK, the Type 26 is the first frigate that we've designed for this operating environment. It's not ice hardened, but you don't need that in the Barents Sea or Norwegian seas, but it is at least designed for the extreme weather up north. So we are, for our own purposes, we have some products on the market that are appealing there. Some of our natural competitors are also disadvantaged. The Canadians, the Danes, for understandable reasons, are pivoting away from as much defense industrial dependency on the United States. So we are seeing more interest than ever in British weaponry from the High North states. This is reflected in the Norwegian destroyer deal. The Danes are considering acquiring a ship based on the UK Type 31 as its new centerpiece of its navy, and the Canadians are thinking in terms of Type 26s as the base of their new River-class ships. So I would actually see this as the opportunity for redressing the UK's gradual decline as an arms exporter. 20 years ago, we were number 3 in the world. Right now, we're number 6.
Much of an issue, we've obviously, a lot of the focus has been obviously on the SDR, in the absence of not having a dip, obviously, industry is being pointed to the SDR as the sort of signal setter, basically. How much of a issue is it? Do you think that actually, our main commitments around the High North have obviously come beyond the SDR?
I think that's an issue. I think there is also an issue in terms of coherence cross-government. So the SDR obviously highlights more commitments than we can realistically prioritize, at least under current budgets and under current geopolitical circumstances. Also, we're not necessarily always responsive to our allies' desire for us showing the flag. I was in Greenland this past September as they were doing their Arctic Light military exercises. They quite frankly complained to me that The French had sent 4 warships up by Greenland within the last year, and the UK had not sent one. Now, obviously, the Nook and the Greenlandic coast is not necessarily the most strategic location when one thinks about the geography of the North Atlantic, but on the other hand, the Danes are a key ally, and if we want them to view us as their primary security partner, we ought to prioritize showing the flag there.
And I've got another question, but I think it relates more to the next question, so I will ask.
Right, thank you much. Right, let's move then on to UK defence capabilities with Ms. Scroggham.
Thank you, Chair. I think I was going to direct this question initially to Mr. Arnold, but in light of the comments on the one astute boat out in Australia, it is actually in Australia now. To what extent are the UK Armed Forces prepared or properly equipped for operations in the High North, and if they're not, what further capabilities do you think they require? I was going to come to Marc in light of
I'll go first and I'll jump in.
Well, I'll count on Ed to fill in a lot more because he has more experience, particularly being on the ground in the High North. Our capabilities are improving, but we took a long vacation from preparing for operating in the High North environment. So, which means that we both did not procure equipment that's fit for purpose. We didn't exercise, so we don't even know which of our equipment really works up there. And we also lost a lot of the practical human skills. And in some ways, I would put more of an emphasis on that because it is a unique environment. Unless you're operating there frequently, you lose the ability to deploy and function. So the first time that we sent our carrier up into northern waters, so in the 1980s, we conducted military exercises alongside our NATO partners in the Norwegian High North every other year. 2-week-long carrier exercises every other year, quite intensive. Between the 1990s and 2022, we just stopped doing it. When we sent our carrier up for the first time in 2022, there were, for a substantial amount of time, they were unable to take off or land aircraft because they had forgotten how to deal with icing on the bridge and icing on the runway. All sorts of other technical issues emerged as electronics and people were confronted with environments that they were not used to dealing with. Our helicopter pilots had the Norwegians have to give them polar bear safety briefings as they were operating over land with polar bears. And the same effect is true for issues like sea ice. The United Kingdom did not, between the late 90s and 2018, UK submarines did not operate under the ice pack, meaning that a lot of the human skills in terms of knowing how to, the unique acoustic qualities of operating under ice had been lost. And to my knowledge, we have not operated under ice since 2018, but sometimes that stuff can be quite sensitive. So we lost a lot of the skills. And the only way to redevelop those is to go up into the High North on a regular basis. That also means that we don't know exactly how well our equipment performs. I don't think that we know how well a Type 45 destroyer operates in High North weather. Now, obviously, a lot of our fleet as it is, Type 23s are beyond the end of their useful life. We are eagerly awaiting the replacements of Type 26s and Type 31s. So we are procuring things, but that also depends on the defense equipment program being fully funded. So, yeah.
Thank you. to Mr. Arnold. Thank you.
I think Marc did a very good job. I mean, I would emphasise the human element. It's an unforgiving environment. The environment will kill you far quicker than the enemy will up there. But also I think it's really important that even fairly modest training in those environments can have lasting application. And that is kind of the approach that we are doing by rotating units. I mean, it's probably one of the only benefits of not having lots of units in the British Army, as an example, is that they can rotate through. So if you have a couple of weeks of training, you can remember that for if you then have to do a quick notice deployment. So I think the priority is effectively getting everyone in the UK military trained in cold weather, even if it is...
On that subject in particular, we're looking at increasing the numbers that we rotate out there. Do you think we're already well equipped to take those numbers? It would appear that we're already running at hotter levels with the numbers up there now, and if we're going to increase by another 1,000, do you think we're equipped to do that as we stand?
Yes, because if we take Norway and specifically the Royal Naval and Royal Marines relationship, I mean, that has been going for a long time. One of the things that we have done, it's not just about training, it's also about the logistics that sits behind that. So the Commando Helicopter Squadron that operates up there as well, because the logistics are just as important as the combat capabilities. What the UK has also been doing is sort of diversifying. So whereas the Navy holds a relationship predominantly with Norwegians, in terms of our activity that we're doing jointly with Finland has increased dramatically, including with 3 Ranger, ditto for the Swedish armed forces. I think some members of one of the Ranger regiments just got their Jaeger badges, so they're doing a lot of interoperability up there. But also I think you have to look at the broader picture of UK military, which we are on the hook to provide SACA Strategic Reserve. Wherever that may deploy in the future, it's almost certainly going to be a Nordic or a Baltic nation. So this training is absolutely foundational. I think we also need to start to move away from exercises and move to rehearsals. The difference between that and sort of military terminology is you've been given your orders. So NATO has a regional plan, we have our orders. So I think we need to start to do more sort of very specific activity, which is rehearsing the regional plan. If you look at the sort of exercise laydown between NATO, the UK, then all of the minilaterals, it is very complex. I think rationalising that would be really important, and actually leading to more of a persistent presence. So again, I think we put a lot of emphasis on exercises, and exercises are really important. But you know, when our carrier strike group goes to the High North, if it is deliberate Kremlin policy to go to war, they're not going to do it when their carrier is in the High North. They'll probably do it the week after they come back and everyone's on shore leave. So we need to make sure that that presence up there is persistent. And I think, you know, we've already covered the anti-submarine warfare capability, which the UK does have significant capabilities as a proportion of NATO, but also this element of probably strike if we're moving to combat operations within the region, that at the moment Atlantic Bastion and the associated sort of concept, they're all about surveillance. Great, so you know where Russian submarine activity is, but if you're then moving over to combat operations, then you need to have the ability to prosecute that. And I think, you know, we've mentioned it already in terms of the First Sea Lords directive, and it is effectively to fight with what you have, which with a sort of planning assumption of 2029, and then have a plan underneath that of where the gaps are, which again is
that is the plan going forward. But do you think we are properly equipped for operations there as we speak?
I think it's difficult to assess that on availability, because the issue is you never have your full strength, whether it be personnel or capabilities. I think a lot more needs to be done on making sure that all of our assets, particularly naval assets, are ready, in the sense that the ships can go to sea, but also that you have the requisite personnel, trained personnel to go on. The picture does not look good at the moment, particularly in terms of a lot of our sub-capacity, which, you know, we've had to extend sea patrols, etc. So that really needs to be fixed as a foundational level, before sort of adding all of the additional sort of Type 31s and 26s, which are not due to come online sort of from 28 to 35.
Thank you. And obviously we're looking at what capabilities we've got now. Are these capabilities that are specific to the High North, or are they capabilities that we would be able to send out globally?
I mean, we would be able to send them out globally. I think it's a political prioritisation, and what we have seen over the last couple of years is a focus on the Euro-Atlantic, and within that a particular focus on the Arctic and High North. So I would probably assume that a lot of these capabilities will stick in or will stay in the Euro-Atlantic area over the coming years. It'd be a political decision on whether to move those assets out of that area, probably in consultation with allies.
Finally, what further capabilities do you think we need?
So you said something very well at the beginning. Did you say ready? Or are we ready or capable? I suppose I would say ready for what? Because if we're looking at current threats in the High North, we're looking at a lot of below the threshold activities, a lot of hybrid of softening up of communities across the Arctic by the Russians, whether that's Russian-speaking people in Estonia or Finland or further north. So you've got, it seems to me, let's think other conflicts we've seen the Russians in Georgia, 2008 Crimea. There's always an initial phase. So coming back to your very provocative question, are we ready to recognise, I think, those under the threshold activities in the Arctic and where they might lead? And then you said something else really interesting, which does come back to numbers and capability. So there's always boots on the ground, but there will be other capabilities absolutely indispensable to operations in the Arctic, like people who can actually navigate vessels across the Arctic. You know, we're short engineers. So I think you have mountain leaders, Royal Marines, commandos, who will operate. And then you have the issue of numbers behind that. You have what the First Sea Lord said. Are we ready for an all-society approach, as the Finns are, to what we will see? And softening up will, or mischief-making, as I call it, will inevitably be the first phase. And it's how you react to that first phase that the Russians also react to. So I think you're entirely right to think about numbers and capabilities, but it's attitude, and then it's not just boots on the ground, it's everybody else who'll be the teeth and tail of operations in extremely difficult capability conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, before we move on to Canada and Norway, we've got 3 quick supplementaries just around this area, starting off with Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Vore, I just want to ask you about the Carrier Strike Group. Specifically, how will Russia interpret our trip to the High North with the Carrier Strike Group?
So, thanks for that question. The Russians probably will interpret this trip to the High North with the Carrier Strike Group the way they did the 2022 deployment to the Norwegian Sea, which is basically as political gesticulation. I don't think that they're going to read much military threat into that, and then also, as the Right Honourable Member in the previous set of questions suggested, one UK carrier strike group is not in and of itself a threat to Russia. So for the carrier strike group to send a powerful message, and whether that's a message that can deter Russia, and the only messages that will deter Russia are messages that frighten Russia to some degree, the carrier strike group would need to cooperate very heavily with Nordic air forces. So if we're asking how could Atlantic strike be executed, for the foreseeable future, the heavy lifting is not by the Royal Navy, but is by the excellent Swedish and Norwegian air forces, that could perhaps be supplemented by a UK and other allied carriers showing up, and maybe 1 or 2 submarines that we could put hypothetically, in the waters up there that could launch cruise missiles. But the vast majority of any form of Atlantic strike is going to have to come from land-based Nordic air power, whereas what we're providing would be command and control and some exquisite enabling capabilities, but those are only valuable insofar as we've practiced and integrated with our 10 squadrons of advanced 4th and 5th generation Nordic aircraft.
What would be the best message it could send? You know, we've got an opportunity to do this. What is the best version of this, basically?
So I'd say that probably there is the peacetime deterrence message, and then there is the wartime posture message. Now, the peacetime deterrence message, I think, is that ourselves and our European allies have the capacity to deploy significant strike assets within range of things that the Russians care deeply about, notably their concentration of military capabilities on the Kola Peninsula. And that if Russia engages in a war elsewhere, those will be held at risk. The Russians think that our policymakers will blink or back down if we view ourselves as held at risk by their cruise missile submarines, which probably likely reflects the fact that they are uncomfortable making military decisions if we can hold their aspects at risk. Once again, one carrier is a good start, but I would love to get other assets up there. I'd love to have the French send their carrier at the same time. Now, what is the wartime message? The wartime message would be trying to replicate the NATO maritime strategy of the 1980s. Now, during the 1970s, NATO had a debate which was basically what is the best way of preventing Russian submarines from cutting NATO supply chains in the central Atlantic and from preventing Russian cruise missile submarines from hitting our key assets. Now, ultimately in the 1980s, the way they discovered was that the best way of preventing the Russians from holding us at risk is by holding them at risk. That if we are deploying major surface assets into the Norwegian Sea or Norwegian fjords, that then the Russians are going to keep more of their Yasen-class submarines and major assets closer to home to act defensively as opposed to trying to transit into the North Atlantic to pose a threat to us offensively.
And have you got any thoughts on using it as a distraction technique?
A distraction technique from?
All the other things that Russia is thinking about at the moment.
Yes, I think that it will also play that function, that Russia is a hyper-centralized state. So there are significant bandwidth issues at the top, and having a carrier exercising or rehearsing credibly will probably add to that distraction. I think I hope that's part of the purpose. If that is, the press release that came out, was it last week, on the deployment of the carrier group was badly bungled. The press release essentially described it in very fluffy, defensive terms where it should have maintained some ambiguity. It should say that the Prince of Wales is heading towards the Norwegian seas to operate with allies and to exercise a range of options. So in some ways, I think that we have got into a negative habit over the course of our deployments to East Asia, where our purpose was really sort of using the carriers as giant diplomatic boats. and that our communication strategy is still focused that way, and we're therefore missing a lot of our distraction potential in doing things like Operation Firecrest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right, on to Fred Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just reflecting on the capabilities point and personal reflection, which maybe to kind of balance some of the things you were saying about the UK kind of divesting of our abilities. When I finished Royal Marines training in 2018, my first action was sent straight to Norway 3 or 4 months straight off the bat into Arctic warfare training. That was 2018. The people training me were sergeants and colour sergeants who were extremely experienced. They'd all done 20 years of Iraq, Afghanistan. But the Marines maintained the ability to soldier and train in the High North, even despite relentless deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. So the UK did keep some of its capability, noting the point you made, Dr. Marc, about maybe not testing some of the kind of larger platform equipment. My question, for anyone who wants to take it, is around what the perception of that, let's say, infantry Arctic warfare capability is amongst our European allies. And Dr. Marc, you've spoken about French a couple of times. It may be good to hear about that. And you know, I know my colleague Michelle was there a couple of weeks ago visiting with the Armed Forces Parliamentary Screen. And you know, things are changing. When I was there, it was Bardufoss. Now we've gone to Camp Viking, and the numbers are much bigger. But they never tailed off to zero. You know, there was always a regular, we're going to keep being good at this. Yeah, but I'm interested in the perception of what is the UK's capability in that kind of ground role amongst colleagues. Maybe colleagues outside of Jeff might be interesting to hear about. Anyone?
Yeah, so, well, just a couple of things. If I can jump back. The Arctic is an incredibly performative place, and the law of the sea does apply. And I think it's very important that that presence is persistently exercised. And the Russians do take note that the law of the sea does apply, and freedom of navigation must guide us, I think. So it's not just about exercises, it's about saying we're here, we exercise our rights, and we will transit. So just to add to that, the Russians are terribly impressed with our Arctic capabilities in terms of Royal Marines Special Forces, and they do comment. I remember 2018 when there was the political debate about the presence. They are, I think, and I know the mountain leaders are under strength at the moment, that is something that the enemy takes very, very seriously in terms of that capability. And the Russian press has commented on the exercises and the permanent positioning in Norway. So if you're thinking about deterrence, I think having those very specialised forces in play will give pause and allow the Russians to think seriously. They've looked very hard at the Norwegian alignment because the Norwegians treaded such a careful line historically with the Russians, not provoking, and they've seen a clear distinction now between what the UK and Norway will do, and I think that does give pause. The Russians have been seriously weakened by the war in Ukraine. They will look at capabilities and what they might face. So if it's any indication, the Russian press does look at that.
And amongst allies?
The Russians admire more. No.
Yeah, so I think amongst allies, I mean, it is something that traditionally we've been obviously very good at, and it is something that they absolutely appreciate. The sort of the growing three-ranger cooperation with the Finns and Swedes as well, I think is very important, and we're starting to do more of that. I sense that there's an element of service rivalry as well in the north, which the UK may be doing better or could do better at by actually putting more army personnel through the sort of the training package that we have in Norway, not having to push them to sort of Finland and Sweden. But I think 2 points. I mean, there is an issue because although the Royal Marines have been training and operating in Norway for a long time, Norway's role within NATO's defence plan has fundamentally transformed with Finland and Sweden. So it's more of a sort of reception, staging, onward integration sort of site, with then reinforcements being pushed further to the east. So I think there's a lot that actually the commandos need to understand of saying, well, actually, what is their purpose in Norway? Are they to be pushed further east? Can they be quite easily potentially bypassed by the Russians? And also, critically, do they have the strike capabilities to back it up? So absolutely, the UK can get into positions where they are doing, active reconnaissance against the Russians. But if they don't have that strike capability, then they're just effectively watching Russian dispositions. And I think there is also important note to make about the Russians in terms of what they did in Ukraine. Because they went in battalion tactical groups, they basically flooded the 1st Battalion Tactical Group, which was destroyed. 2nd came in, and then they started to pull the ones in from the 3rd Battalion Tactical Group, which effectively meant that all of their trainers were killed. So they are not looking at Arctic training at the moment. You know how difficult it is. So again, back to an earlier point I made on the sort of the opportunity that NATO has here. We have active Arctic warfare skills. We are scaling them. More allies are going north to get that training. The Russians, it is really quite low, and they are still prioritizing very poor sort of offensive capabilities within Ukraine, not they've said that they want to create a division in Karelia, etc. But that's pretty difficult when you're in that fight. So within the next couple of years, NATO could be in a completely different position in the north. NATO as an alliance and its individual members can't lose that advantage.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Right, let's talk about Canada then. The UK's 2025 Strategic Defence Review highlighted that Canada is a vital ally for our transatlantic security, and we know that whether it's through Five Eyes, whether it's through NATO, and also Canada's ability to now build 15 the River-class destroyers, which are based on the UK's Type 26 frigate design. We're also aware about the huge training facility in Alberta, so the British Army Training Unit in Suffield, so which is apparently 7 times the size of the Salisbury plane training. So I think, given all of that, what are your views about closer collaboration between Canada and the UK, and should that come in the form of GEF membership? I know that the Canadians politely declined back in 2013, but should we resurrect that? Professor Kennedy-Pipe, shall we start off with yourself?
So the Canadians did decline that invitation, and that was interesting as signalling their own intent. I think certainly closer collaboration and a framework mechanism would be indispensable in terms of the Canadian interests in the Arctic. High North is rather different because the Canadians do have their own interests in the Arctic, and so it's how that would fit in terms of our High North focus and their really rather different view of the Arctic. So should the GEF expand, or should it be aligned through framework partner nations, I think is the big question for many people. Of course, Canada, Commonwealth, ally. Many of us think we should use the Commonwealth more visibly as is possible in terms of military sharing and alignment. I'm just quite hesitant to see the GEF beyond the 10 diluted at this moment, but certainly closer collaboration. High North, I wonder how closely Canada's geostrategic interests sit in the High North as opposed to in other parts of the Arctic.
Right. Dr. DeVore, given now Donald Trump's assertions about whether it's buying or annexing Greenland, or whether it's the derogatory remarks about Canada, given that context, do you think that they would be more amenable to GEF membership? Because that also would mean that 6 out of the 8 Arctic nations, excepting the US and Russia, would all be members of GEF, and therefore this might be that time. Do you think that that should be done?
So I think that they probably would be more amenable, and they are broadly trying to diversify their security partnerships, and I think GEF would be a logical next step in doing that. And in addition to trying to buy Type 26 from us, they've also decided to buy Swedish fighter aircraft. So a possibility of aligning with Jeff, I think, is highly likely. Now, I would have two caveats that, in terms of conditions that I would pose for their membership on Jeff, because I have the same concerns that Carolyn has. The first is their commitment to higher levels of defense funding. As Ed mentioned, at the moment, we are at the trailing end of Jeff. And one of the reasons why Jeff functions so well is that this is sort of the club of European and NATO members that actually feel threatened and are willing to step up more in terms of funding and more in terms of realistic preparations. The Canadians promised in 2014 that they were going to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Only last year did they finally achieve that through creative accounting. They threw everything into the defense budget: Veterans Affairs, their Signals Intelligence Agency, their domestic information infrastructure expenditures. So in some ways, introducing the Canadians today into Jeff would introduce a country that would be at the very tail end in terms of commitments, in terms of what they're committing to security and defense. Second issue is Carolyn's issue, is that I would love to have the Canadians as a member of Jeff if we could define what is Jeff's sphere of responsibility. It would pose a lot of significant dilemmas for Jeff if the Northwest Passage and the Asia-Pacific Arctic all of a sudden fit in with Jeff's sphere of competence. So essentially, I would love to bring the Canadians in. Yep. They operate in the area. They're very professional. They're Five Eyes, so we can exchange intelligence and planning with them quite seamlessly. But I would like them to nail their flag to the mast when it comes to higher defense spending. And for them to join Jeff, I would like a real delimitation of saying what is the geographical sphere of competence within which Jeff functions.
Okay. Mr. Arnold, in terms of collaboration between the UK and Canada, the River-class destroyers would obviously, I would say, offer excellent protection for the UK and Norwegian Type 26 frigates, in terms of one could concentrate on the anti-submarine activities, while the River-class destroyers, they're primarily an anti-air platform. Now, given that context, what are your views about Canadian membership of Jeff? Do you think that that's not required, or do you think it should be something that the government should pursue?
I think it's something that the government should pursue, and I think, what Marc said, I absolutely agree with, that there does seem to be a bit of a change in terms of defence and security posture with the Canadians, with the new government. They need to show that they are absolutely serious, which I think is important. And equally, because of the sort of changing posture with the US, sort of looking at security of the homeland, it actually gives the Canadians potentially a bit of an opportunity to push more of their assets over onto sort of the in terms of the High North and support. So I think it's not just about defence spending, it's also about deployability, bearing in mind that the Canadians deployed to Kandahar, they were fighting in the south with the UK. They can, they should be wanting to do that in terms of a proactive manner to also pull more of the European sort of focus westward as well. I think in particular on Jeff, what I think the Canadians will primarily look at is how the Jeff has treated Denmark over Greenland, which is pretty poor, quite frankly, from a Jeff perspective collectively, but also the UK. So last year, when sort of Greenland started to get back into the discussion after President Trump came back, the strongest words were from President Macron and then Chancellor Scholz. When it came around the second time as well, it was the Nordics first, so Sweden, Finland. Then it was President Macron and then Chancellor Merz. and then the UK sort of slightly on the side, and nothing around it from a Jeff point of view. So I think from Canada, you'd be actually saying, well, is Jeff right for us? I think the other thing that is slightly complicated this now is Jeff offered enhanced partnership to Ukraine last year, which was a bit more of a sort of political symbolism, because right about then the narrative was whether a NATO membership would be forthcoming. So Jeff sort of gives that political level. The Ukrainians are going to take part in Line Protector later this year with the mine hunting vessels that we were not able to get into the Black Sea to support them. So they are sort of starting to do activity. But then it does complicate. So you've got Jeff Plus, which is sort of the plug-in, which has been offered to anyone who wants it, but particularly to look at Germany and France and Canada. You've now got this enhanced partnership, which is sort of special to Ukraine, and then you've got full membership. So I think it's slightly sort of muddied sort of what all of these terms mean. But I think the invite to Canada, as it was previously given, and kind of just, it was, the door was always open, it didn't turn off until 2013, it's just sort of when you're ready. And I think the geopolitical situation, both the threat from Russia but also the changing unpredictability of the US, makes the geopolitical reasoning for Canada joining pretty concrete.
Right, perfect. Oh, right, a quick supplementary from Emily.
It's at the end, Chair.
Oh, at the end.
I just want to ask at the end something, sorry.
In that case, then, we'll move on to Michelle Scroggins. So just a couple more questions, and then I promise we will be trying to finish on time. But yeah, Michelle Scroggins.
Thank you, Chair. We touched earlier on our UK Command of Forces in Norway and the work they do. I was lucky enough to spend a week with them recently and saw just how formidable they are. It'd be interesting to see how much more formidable they would be with new capabilities and newer equipment, but I'll set that aside for now. How well do you think the UK is actually integrating with our allies, particularly Norway, with the Lunar House Agreement and the Type 26 frigate programme? I'll probably end this, Ed, if that's okay.
I mean, very well in terms of integrating. I think Norway is really sort of the benchmark. I think particularly in the region, but there's other areas. My worry is that if you look at all of the bilateral deals that we've done over the years, quite often the bilateral deals are signed by the Foreign Secretary, so they're done through the FCDO to the Ministry, but they're generally resourced by the MOD because they have a large defence component. So at the moment, if you start to look at all of the things that we have sort of signed up to with the UK at the centre of the web, the issue will be is if there is a crisis, all of our allies are going to pull on that string and say, well, you promised us this, you promised us that. So if it's mutual defence with Finland and Sweden, moving up to a brigade in Estonia, we still have a commitment under K4 to Kosovo under Sandrock, which we had to reinforce 2 years ago. Now we've got Lunar House, we have Trinity House, obviously UK, French, Lancaster House. Crises happen gradually and suddenly. If all of our allies say, you promised this to us, there's effectively nothing less. And the fact that at the moment politically, in terms of support to Ukraine and potentially deploying a reassurance force there, that is a lot of capability that we potentially don't have. So we're going to have to prioritise, and that may mean sort of letting some allies down.
I'll leave it there, Chair, in light of the time.
Right, thank you very much. Right, on to Emily.
Quite a straightforward question, and I don't know if you'd feel comfortable answering it or not, but just based on everything that all three of you have said today, and you're our experts, you know a lot more than I do, do you envisage military conflict in the High North and the Arctic, and if so, when do you think that might be?
Yes, I do.
You do? And do you think it's imminent, 10, 20, or...?
Under the threshold, it's already happening.
So we're already there?
Yeah, and I think that if you look at the level of Russian incidents, whether it be critical infrastructure or that pulling on the strings of treaties, it's already there. And that came back to my earlier point about how long is the first phase. But yes.
Does anyone else want to comment?
Yes, I think that conflict in the High North is almost certain within the time frame of the next 10, 15 years. Now, it might not be a conflict where the cause of the conflict is the High North. It could be that we have another iteration of Russia-Ukraine or a Russian conflict with the Baltic states. and therefore it's what ticks off in the High North is sort of epiphenomenal to a conflict or secondary to a conflict that occurs elsewhere. There are also potential causes of conflict in the High North, but I think that one of these going violent within the next decade or two is extremely likely.
Thank you. What about yourself, Ed?
I mean, NATO is the defensive alliance, so NATO isn't going to instigate a war with Russia, particularly not in the Arctic or High North. The Kremlin may do it through deliberate policy, and I'd say the time frame for that being likely is around sort of the next 3 to 5 years. The issue is it could just happen through miscalculation, and that could happen tomorrow. So when you have a variety of people on the NATO side saying, well, we'll be ready in 29, we'll be ready in 27, whatever it may be, the enemy does get a vote, and if it happens through miscalculation, you do need to be ready to respond immediately.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Kennedy-Pipe, Dr. Vore, Mr. Arnold. It has been an absolutely fascinating session, and you have laid an excellent foundation for our inquiry in the High North with this first hearing on that. But with that, I call the meeting to a conclusion. Order, order.